Hello, welcome to Data Umbrella's webinar. I'm going to do a brief introduction about Data Umbrella, and then Sarah will do her talk. And during the talk, you can put any questions you have in the chat, and we'll answer them at the end. This is being recorded. About Data Umbrella, we're a community for underrepresented persons in data science. We're a nonprofit, and we organize data science events for the community. This is our team that makes it happen behind the scenes. I'm in New York. Beryl is in Kenya. Christina is also in New York over in Brooklyn. And Sangam is out of India. We have a code of conduct, and we thank you for helping to make this a welcoming, friendly community for all that people want to keep returning to. There are various ways to support Data Umbrella. The first and foremost is to follow our code of conduct. We'd love it if you could share our events with people in your network. And we have various ways that you can contribute to Data Umbrella and open source. We do video timestamps of all of our webinars, and that helps people find where they want to go to in the recording earlier. Our website is open source. We've done open source sprints with PyMC and scikit-learn as well. Our blog is open source on GitHub, and we have a data events board, which is in production currently. You can also donate to our nonprofit. We're on Open Collective, and if you work for a company that uses Benevity, they will match your donation dollar for dollar. If you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, all of our webinars for the past 3.5 years are on there, and they're data science, open source, Python, R, and career development. One of our playlists is career advice. And other playlists are data visualization, contributing to open source. We have a series on PyMC and NumPy as an example. We also have a monthly newsletter at dataumbrella.substack.com, and we aim to get a newsletter out for the first of the month. We do not send too many emails. If anything, we may send fewer than once a month. So if you're interested, sign up for our newsletter. And these are our most commonly linked. You can copy the QR code, and it'll open up our most popular links. This platform has live captioning, so at the very top it says CC for closed captioning. If you want to click on that, it'll give you a live transcript at the bottom. And there is an option to choose different languages, although I hear that English is the most accurate one. We have an online suggestion box, and I'll post the link there as well. But if you have any suggestions for future event topics, if you have feedback on this event, if you experience any technical issues that you'd like to let us know about or anything else, let us know. Our upcoming events for November 15th, we're having Figma for beginners, for data science people. And November 28th, Model Risk Management Best Practices for Data Science, which is a great finance topic. Today's talk is exploring the open source landscape in Australia. Sae Ra Germaine is the Deputy CEO and Manager, Member and Academic Services, VALA President, and Linux Australia Council member. Sae Ra is a strong advocate for IT and open source, especially in the library industry. As a side gig in her not-so-day job, Sae Ra is a serial conference organizer, I can relate to that, running the inaugural Everything Open conference and 5 linux.conf.aus. In the library space, Sae Ra has been key in bringing the first installation of the open source library management platform Folio to Australia. You can find Sae Ra on LinkedIn as Sae Ra Germaine and on Twitter as Ms_Mary_Mac. And with that, I'm going to hand over the microphone, the screen, and the video to Sae Ra.
Thank you, everyone. Just going to share my slides. Bear with me a moment. Now, hopefully everyone will be able to see it. So, Wominjeka, everyone, and Wominjeka in the First Nations language of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne is welcome, and hopefully you'll learn something from here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia and the world where we live, learn and work. I acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other First Nations peoples and communities, and recognise a continuing connection to land, waters, sky, and culture. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And on the weekend, we unfortunately was unable to pass a referendum in Australia to recognise the Indigenous peoples of this land. So I'd like to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm here to talk to you about exploring the open source landscape in Australia. I've also added in my Mastodon account if anyone would like to follow me from there. So as was already mentioned, I'm the Deputy CEO of Kaval, and Kaval is a not-for-profit library services organisation. We look after anything and everything back office when it comes to libraries, and that includes storage facilities. So we've got a massive storage facility. We also have a shared collection of last copy print research materials, which includes some fantastic items such as a first copy of Return of the King, a first edition copy of that. And we've also got multiple copies of, weirdly, the Mills and Boon collection in Australia. And it's the full set, and not many people own the full set. We do. And turns out that it does actually have some research value. So that's why we've got it on stock. I'm also the president of VALA, and VALA is a library technology organization that aims to share and grow everyone's skills in the library tech sector. More and more every day, we start to lose our control over technology as we start to move to SaaS platforms, and we'd like to actually help bring those skills back into organizations. I'm also a previous Linux Australia president and current Linux Australia council member, and I'll talk a little bit about Linux Australia later on. I'm also an advisor for the .au domain administrators. So in Australia, there's one body that looks after the .au, or like similar to .com.au, where we look after those domain names to ensure that there's integrity behind all the websites that have a .au domain. This helps with, the reducing of spam, because, a lot of domain names just churn out spam at the moment. So I'm an advisor on that committee. And I'm also a huge support of the Open GLAM movement, where it's bringing open source and open methodologies into the library sector. So I'd just like to note that whilst I'm representing a lot of these organizations, I'm not actually speaking on their behalf. So this is all views of my own. So for me, I love community, and the best way to describe me is a bit of a community holic. And I've got a bit of a tech brain, and I have an honours degree in computing from Federation University. And whilst my degree was centered around code, I really wanted to focus around the human elements of technology. My first introduction to free and open source was not all that long ago, in 2002, when I went to one of my first university subjects in operating systems. And I have to actually give a shout out to my lecturer at the time, Dr. Kylie Turville, who not only showed me the wonderful world of Linux and open source, but showed me that women in computing could actually succeed. But communities were all around me. I grew up overseas and learned a lot about traditions, cultures, and especially how people interact with each other. After the years went on, I was a member of various student organizations. And okay, I have to admit some things here. I was one of those strange people who loved group assignments, and I still do today. I love dealing with different types of personalities, helping convince them to be the best person that they could be. In open source, we all know that without community, open source would not exist. A strong and engaged community can help ensure the longevity of an open source project. Now, I tried looking for a good map of Australia, especially with Australia in the centre. But turns out, after looking, I found one of these. And just to give a bit of context, this is Australia in a map and how much it covers the US. And so for size, it sort of gives you that sort of understanding. And there's some maps online that just completely ignores Australia and New Zealand, and that's probably not the best thing either. But here, I finally found a map, and sorry about the terrible pixelation, but there's not many good maps with Australia right in the centre. But a lot of open source activity happens here in the US and in Europe, but not so much. Oh, that shouldn't happen like that. In Australia, I'll go back one so you can still see Australia. And it's purely because we don't actually have the population size. And we also don't have the funding available in IT in comparison to the US or Europe. In the US, for example, you have a lot of angel investors and a lot of, a lot of funding and grants that are available in sponsorship dollars that Australia doesn't necessarily have. A lot of our developers move over to the US just to get that funding. In Europe, for example, the German government has specific policies on open source software to be the norm in its rollouts. Australia, not so much. We do run a lot of activities in Australia, and from my understanding, we are the 13th largest users of open source, but we don't necessarily recognize that. Back in 2008, the open source industry generated about $500 million a year. Australia's current population is about 26.5 million people. It is projected that there will be needed to have 1.2 million tech jobs by 2030, and to be able to keep the Australian economy up with the rest of the world. Today, we only hire about 653,000 tech workers, and most of them are not strictly in this tech sector. So time zones, why do we even do them? I find it personally frustrating, but I wanted to thank you all for actually joining us and allowing me to talk to you at a relatively sane time for me. Time zones are also a bit terrible when it comes to us, especially during daylight saving. We're about a 21-hour flight away from New York, 24 hours from London, and flights to London are so long that they even include spaces for people to stretch on the plane so that they don't have severe blood clots. Just last week, I was on a call with Amsterdam, Ottawa, Washington, and myself in Melbourne. And the best time for all of us to be awake and functional and doing crucial work was at 1 a.m. Melbourne time, which is unfortunate for me. And doing 2 weeks of this, as well as my 9-to-5 day job, was just unsustainable and probably wouldn't be sustainable going forward. So the distance is terrible and it's hard to collaborate, especially with open source projects. But our time zone is great for things like tech changes. So in the US, while you're all asleep, we're actually here fixing up your systems to make sure that they're still going on the days that you're back during business hours. So apart from the great maintenance and the support, this is a little showcase of what we do on our corner of the world. So this is a massive slide, and I do have to apologize, but this is just a small snippet of the types of people and projects that come out of Australia and New Zealand. And I do want to highlight New Zealand as well, because it is what we jokingly call the East Island of Australia. And I do need to give some kudos to Hugh Blemmings for this slide. Unfortunately, not all of it has come up on the screen, but I'm sure you'll be able to see them afterwards. So this is a bit of an eye chart, and you're not going to be able to pick out all the names. And this really is just to showcase some of the people that I have interacted with or have met in the past. And just to focus on a few of them. For example, John Lyons in the Lyons book. John Lyons was actually a lecturer at the University of New South Wales and is a very renowned computer scientist in Australia. John was known for his book called John Lyons Commentary on the Unix 6th edition. And the book is actually course notes that actually does a line-by-line commentary of the Unix kernel. Now, this 6th edition was actually allowed to be used in classes and was the only book that actually did a line-by-line commentary. And to this day is probably known to be the most illegally copied book in the computer science world, because it was just photocopied quite heavily. And this was released nearly 50 years ago, but it's still considered to be one of the best books for commenting code. So when the University of New South Wales established what's called the John Lyons Chair in operating systems. This involved raising about $1 million of funding to create this position in perpetuity. This is where Linux Australia, the organisation that I was part of, came in. In 2006, one of our conferences, it was suggested that we actually do some funding to support this chair. And we also organised some donation matching. And in the end, we raised about $48,000 to be able to establish this. And we also, as a prize for donating the most amount of money, we actually signed a fair few of the community actually signed the book. And the book has now been donated back to the University of New South Wales to be able to be viewed. Another person that I'd like to highlight is Andrew Tridgell, who's a very renowned Australian technologist. In 2005, he gave a talk at one of the open source conferences, linux.conf.au, which I'll talk about later. And he chatted to us about the interoperability of version control systems and the lack of a free and open source version. And turns out after some rigorous discussion with Linus Torvalds, it was actually Linus's catalyst to write what we know as today Git. He also gave us Samba, which allows for Linux and Unix machines to talk to Windows, and rsync, which is a very commonly used tool today that allows for systems to efficiently transfer and synchronize files between computers and storage drives and networks by comparing modification times and file sizes. And still to this day, it's used quite heavily. He's now actually in the ArduPilot drone sort of space, and he's actually doing some amazing work there. Next is Rob Thomas, who's actually a bit of a quiet achiever in Australia. And I've known him for about 20 years now, and he's best known for his unwavering dedication to community. He's also the original creator of FreePBX, which is an open source backbone for many phone systems today. And he gets a special mention because he's actually running the Everything Open 2024 conference, which I'll talk about later. Now, I know that a significant part of the Data Umbrella community is a Python user base, so I thought I'd highlight some Python users and Python developers in the space in Australia. Russell Keith McGee is the creator of Beware, so BEEWARE, helps with the release of Python code onto multiple platforms. Clinton Roy is the Melbourne-based software developer for the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, which helps researchers use open source software to conduct experiments using the Australian synchrotron. Clinton is also a Python instructor for the software carpentries. Chris Neugebauer is the Python Software Foundation board member, and Chris has run many PyCon conferences in Australia, but also has recently started running the North Bay Python Conference in Petaluma. Katie McLaughlin is previously a director of the Python Software Foundation, and they are currently the secretary of the Django Software Foundation and a Python Software Foundation Fellow. They have also received an O'Reilly Open Source Award. These folks are just a few of the contributors in Australia, but I'd like to especially do a shout out to all of them because they have contributed very heavily to the Python community in Australia. And last but not least, some open data advocacy work is happening in Australia. We have a chief scientist in Australia that is very much in the open access space and is heavily encouraging all of the researchers in Australia to do their research in open access and make their data openly available. A lot of our universities are competing for grant funding, so opening up the data actually helps with a lot more collaboration work to happen across our universities. We have 41 universities in total and not much grant funding to go around, so the more collaboration that we can do, the better. Pia Andrews, who's highlighted on this slide, is actually an open government advocate and has traveled all over the world to help run a rules as code sort of methodology for governments, and she's recently worked in New Zealand and Canada to help them release a lot of their procedures and work online so that the public can actually comment on the activities and the policies that are going on within government. But also, Pia was one of the founding members of GovHack, where the government of Australia and a lot of its state governments have released their code online. Not just their code, but their data online, so that people can come together and actually do some hacking of the code to do some really cool stuff out of it. I know that there's a few projects online where kids have found great trees to take their dogs to so that they can just run around and have a bit of a play. So there's some really cool stuff that's coming out of the code that the government's releasing. Liz Stokes, who hopefully is on this call, I'm not sure, from the ARDC, is a strong advocate for open data and making research data open access. I do know that ARDC is also looking at opening up the open source program office in Australia, and hopefully this will gain a bit of traction. Liz is also a key trainer of the library carpentries in Australia. Sorry, lost my mouse there. So a little bit about Linux Australia. Linux Australia has about 5,000 members, and it's growing year by year by people that are actually turning up to our conferences. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and it's 100% volunteer-driven. We don't pay a single staff member to run the organisation. It is purely the hard work and dedication of these of our members. The revenue is about $500,000 in Australian dollars, but about $320,000 pre-COVID. Obviously, the numbers have gone down a little bit due to COVID, and travel has been a lot harder. But our conferences have tended to attract a lot of people from overseas because it is very much a grassroots campaign that we do run in Australia. We primarily exist to support the regions and the regional networks of Australia, especially around open source and the shared values of communities. We run about 15 events per year with different sort of areas and about 8 different communities. And the communities include the WordPress community, Joomla, Drupal, the Linux community, Python, hacker and maker spaces, geospatial sciences, and recently we've taken on the open GLAM, which is the Galleries, Libraries, Archives and Museums community, because everyone needs a lovely home to live with, and Linux Australia auspices those communities. And by auspicing, we provide the legal frameworks and accounting facilities so that the communities can do what they love doing the most, is sharing their knowledge, and we'll look after the administrivia for you. So as I mentioned, Linux Australia is about 5,000 people, and it was originally founded in 1997 and incorporated in 1999. And at the moment, we're running a massive grants program where we have about $35,000 worth of grants to further the open source story within Australasia, providing funding for initiatives such as providing computers and internet access from remote communities, access to childcare, diversity scholarships to attend conferences, funding to revitalize projects, and also providing support for those communities that may have fallen by the wayside during COVID, but want to rejuvenate themselves and come back. Linux Australia also does a fair bit of advocacy work for not just for libraries, but Australian technology users, For example, in 2021, COVID hit us hard in Melbourne and hit us in a very rough way. We went into lockdown about 6 times, totaling 252 days. We had families just down the street that we actually couldn't look after because we couldn't leave our houses. We had to change the ways that we worked, and people scrambled to move online, and government scrambled even worse. And we found we needed to find ways to look at tracking our people to be able to do COVID positive matching and all of that sort of thing. There was good and bad software written everywhere. And I promised myself I wouldn't actually get into politics today, but this is a good news story, so bear with me. The Australian government specifically launched a little app called COVID Safe. Now, this was a closed source project. A lot of governments overseas released a lot of open source COVID apps so that, it could be scrutinized and all that sort of thing. And suffice to say, it didn't actually sit very well with a lot of the communities in Australia, especially around, digital rights and all of that sort of thing. And the government was trying to track the movements of the citizens without actually understanding what was within the code. So Linux Australia, along with 100 academics and technologists and industry experts, signed an open letter to the government to release that code. It was to let us scrutinize the code and to let us give them feedback so that we can actually make the app worthwhile and actually work. And suffice to say, after weeks of fighting for the cause, and geez, there was a lot of fighting, the government didn't just want to listen, but we won. The code was released, and turns out to this day, the app still hasn't been able to find many people. I think it was about 81 close contacts and around 7.7 million people that actually downloaded the app, and around 11.7 million people that actually tested positive. So it only found 81. So anyway, enough about COVID. What I might do is I might start talking about some of the events that Linux Australia auspices. So for the Python users out there, there's PyConAU, which runs once a year. The last couple of years has been online, except for this year it was in Adelaide. And PyCon is a lovely grassroots conference that brings people together from the data space, from the coding space, but also interestingly, there's a school piece where we bring students in from high schools to showcase their work. And it's not often that they get to showcase their work in front of fantastic developers and to get help from those developers. So it's actually a lovely space for students to join. linux.conf.au is where Linux Australia really started. And linux.conf.au is what actually attracted me to open source and put my hand up to be on the Linux Australia Council. This conference brings together people from all over the world to share their passion, their knowledge for a common goal. We also managed to get Linus Torvalds to attend, and we even got him on stage got him up on stage in a penguin costume. And interestingly enough, the tux, which is what you can see represented here a couple of times, was actually discovered in Canberra, which is our national capital, because there was this penguin sort of walking around and became the mascot for Linux. Linux.conf.au has had very humble beginnings, which started under a different banner called CALU, so CALU, in 1999, which was the conference for Linux users. The whole thing was funded on one person's credit card, and there was no network, no Wi-Fi, and someone actually printed out /dot each day. And since then, linux.conf.au has actually traveled all over the country and sometimes across the ditch to our East Island colleagues in New Zealand, and brought many fantastic names to the conference. Each year, the LCA community tries to find ways to give back to the local city or for a specific cause. We have auctioned off hats, shaved off mustaches, auctioned off some of the latest open hardware, and we've raffled off some Lego, because who doesn't love Lego? But for example, in 2017, we raised about $14,000 to fund 3 interns for the outreachy program for the Software Freedom Conservancy. In 2004, there was a substantial amount of charity provided on the proviso that Linus Torvalds was actually dunked in a dunk tank, and turns out we made that happen. The highest bidder was able to dunk him, and there's pictures online. You should actually look it up. It's quite fantastic. And also, so you can see here in Tasmania in 2009, we actually raised $40,000 to save the Tasmanian devil. And to this day, the Save the Tasmanian Devil organization talk about this amazing group of nerds that donated all their money to save the Tassie devil, and it still has its impact today. I just wanted to quickly quote Jonathan Corbett from the LWN newsletter, that there are lots of reasons why developers create open source software. Beyond the fact that it's simply fun, many of us are motivated by the desire to make the world a better place. Supporting causes like the Tassie Devil goes to show that our desire to improve the world goes beyond the create of great free open source software. It's something that we can be proud of. From here, I wanted to talk about the next stages of linux.conf.au, which is the Everything Open conference. Everything Open is a grassroots conference that delivers highly technical content for a diverse range of attendees. In recent years, we've covered topics around government, privacy, communities, DevOps, the kernel, open hardware, a little bit of Python, and also embraced many other communities such as the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums sector, and also citizen scientists. There was a really cool talk about how someone had taken 1 million photos of an orchid just to catch this one bee on camera. This sector contributes to the open source software in many aspects today, and hopefully changes the lives of many as well. We hopefully attract about 350 to 400 attendees each year. And you can see here that our first conference was actually run here in Naarm, Melbourne, and Naarm is the local Indigenous name for Melbourne. And the next conference is actually in April 2024 in a little country town called Gladstone. If you would like to find out more information about the Everything Open conference, please go to that URL. But also the call for sessions is now open. We do have a lot of travel scholarships and speakers funding as well. So please do not hesitate to submit a talk, because we'd love to have you over, and we will be able to provide funding for some of those talks as well. The conference, as I said, similarly to Linux Australia, is 100% volunteer run, and it's run by open tech enthusiasts for open tech enthusiasts. Organizing a conference is close to a full-time job, but there are some aspects, that hopefully we'll be able to share with everyone else. Being online previously has meant that we've been able to extend our reach, and the 2021 conference that Linux Australia ran was able to have a team consisted of volunteers from Germany, Brazil, India, Australia, New Zealand, and hopefully we'll be able to do something similar soon. And having such a diverse team has allowed us to be more creative with our interactions and deliver to our attendees and communicate in a safe and open way. So with that, I might say thank you and answer any questions that you might have. So,
thanks, Sarah. So yes, we have questions. The first one, which I'm going to ask, which should be quick, the quickest one, is where did you live overseas?
Mostly in the Asian countries. So there was Korea, Hong Kong, there's Indonesia. I was briefly in the US, and obviously in Australia. So all over the place.
Okay. What part of the US?
In Texas.
Okay, so I'll go to the first question from Rowland, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is there is a lot of open source software in bioinformatics, especially R, but I don't think they interact much with the broader open source community in Australia. Do you have any insight into if this is accurate, and if so, why might that be?
It is very accurate, and I'd have to say that it's also quite common with not just the informatics space, but also in GLAM, for example, and a lot of humanities subjects as well. But I think that's because we don't necessarily recognize it as open source, but we recognize it as an open community piece where we love talking about the values of open, but it's not necessarily tied to the technology, if that makes sense. It's more tied to the area of expertise in the sector that we're in. I know from the open GLAM space, I know a lot of librarians that are heavily developing Python modules for various different things, but they don't think of themselves as technologists or part of the open source community. They just think of themselves as this librarian that knows some skills. I think it's upon us, and that's why we started the Everything Open conference, to bring in a wider base for our community and not just talk about open source, but about everything open. Hopefully that answers your question, Roland.
Thank you. The next question is there a way to find out about funding opportunities in the Australian open source space, or even international funding or grants that Australians are eligible for?
Yes. So interestingly, as I mentioned, Linux Australia has $35,000 available. But also, and I'll just put this in the chat, is that I did some research yesterday, and there's actually an open source investors list that might be of interest to people. I'm not sure what the success rate is, but there is definitely funding available. There is also lots of funding available in the digital innovation space, and I don't personally love the word digital innovation, but a lot of local governments are releasing funding for digital innovation, and that does include open source, so give it a go to get the funding from those sort of spots too.
Okay. The next question is from Paige. Similar to Roland's question, there is a large open source software community in the sciences. For example, her background in climate science. Do you know much about these communities in Australia? Or any of the events you have mentioned targeting academic science research communities?
So I'm not directly related to any of those communities, but there is an e-research community that is blossoming in Australia, and it's heavily supported by the universities and is mostly run by the ARDC in Australia. And that hopefully starts bringing people together. But we're also looking at ways that we can Linux Australia is looking at ways that we can support communities going forward. So I know that there's a geospatial conference happening in Fiji that we have supported in the past. There's one running in Auckland as well. So hopefully we can start sort of funding these sort of communities so that they can come together and share that information.
Would you say that the Linux Foundation in Australia sort of is it as wide, like supporting, as the Python Software Foundation in the US is?
I would say that we're the key organization, and I think that's why the Python community has joined Linux Australia, because we do tend to support anyone that has an open methodology. We're not linked at all to the Linux Foundation in the US, but the Linux Australia organizing group, I guess, is purely there to support communities and nothing else. So hopefully the funding can keep going so that we can support it for much longer.
Great. Hadley Wickham of our community and what is now Posit, formerly known as R Studio, is from New Zealand. Is he on the list?
Not on that specific list, no, but I shall add them for next time.
Thank you. Yeah, because he's done an amazing amount for the art community. The next question is from Paige. There is a lot of momentum behind open science in the US government right now. For example, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy declared this year, 2023, to be the year of open science. Do you see any similar momentum taking place at the government level in Australia?
I would love to say yes, but as I mentioned, our chief scientist is a heavy advocate of open science and open source. But the biggest problem is that, like I said, we don't have much in the way of funding when it comes to our universities, and it is mostly government funding that we're reliant upon. And that does mean that there's not enough money to invest into technologies. And we tend to go with whatever the IT departments are throwing at us. And a lot of IT departments tend to think that even though they're heavy users of open source, they don't necessarily realize that. But they see open source and open science and anything open to be a little bit of a threat because it's uncontrolled and they don't have an understanding of it as well as we hope. But hopefully with the new chief scientist, that really, hopefully that starts something, but we tend to lag behind the US about 7 years, I would say, to what the US government is doing in the open space. And I'm actually quite excited what the US is doing because it means that eventually the change will roll into Australia. So we'll see, hopefully.
Does Australia have the same policy as the US, which is that any data that is supported by the US government in terms of funds is open to the public, such as here it's like transportation data, educational data? Is that similar in Australia?
As much as possible it is. But when it comes to research data, it really depends on where the funding's coming from. If it's a commercially funded research project, it doesn't necessarily have to be released publicly, even though the institution is publicly funded. But there are moves to make as much of the data available as possible. I know that Pia, who I mentioned before, had a really hard time back in the day trying to justify why you'd make this data publicly available. And some of the government departments are still dragging their heels a little bit in trying to make this data available, but we'll get there soon, hopefully.
And do you also want to, we had a prep call, it might have been a couple of months ago now, but I remember you shared during that time that one of the other reasons that, there's maybe more funding in open source and tech here is because you said that labor costs are higher in Australia, and that could be another reason as well.
Yes, definitely, because there's not many technologists in Australia, not many, we're a very close-knit community, so the salaries are considerably greater in Australia than in the US. I know that even in the help desk area, a lot of our commercial companies outsource our help desks to the US because it is cheaper to hire Americans than it is to hire Australians. So it does make it quite difficult to get funding for staff in Australia. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people move to the US to get funding because it is easier. There's a lot more money, and it's a lot cheaper to live and work over there as well. So a lot of people move there.
And how about also, are there fewer philanthropic organizations in Australia? And do you know why? I mean, I'm sure there's a good reason. Do you want to elaborate on why there's fewer?
There is a lot fewer purely because our population is a lot smaller as well, but there is a lot less people that are philanthropic in the especially in the tech space, that have significant amounts of money that are willing to share their investing There is a couple in Australia that do a little bit of philanthropic work, but we're still a relatively young country as well. So there isn't as much wealth as there would be in the US. Also, like I mentioned, with universities, out of the 43, I think 41 of them are publicly funded. There isn't many private universities that have significant amounts of money either. So they're all competing for the same government funding, and not many philanthropic research activities happen in Australia because of that.
So, you mentioned the time zones, and in fact, we within our community here, we have had it's been more challenging to get people to attend because we typically, as I mentioned, have people from the West Coast, which is 3 hours behind the East Coast, and then Central Europe, which is 6 hours ahead, and East Africa. Um, are there any, can you think of any ways to deal with the time zone issue, or there just isn't a way to deal with it?
I would love to say that there is, but I think to provide just a little bit of leniency, because I know that a lot of people don't tend to want to work in unsociable hours, which is what we call it in Australia. But say, for example, your 6 or 7 p.m. is our 9 a.m., which makes it a little bit more palatable. But even in Australia, we struggle because we have massive time zone differences from one end of the country to the other, and trying to make it a good place to collaborate just in Australia is difficult as well. So I'd love to have an answer for it, but I think there needs to be I guess asynchronous ways for us to be able to collaborate. There's lots of fantastic tools out there that we can all contribute to that doesn't necessarily require live on the spot interactivity. If there's a way that we can actually do a follow the sun move where I know, for example, there was a conference that happened where it ran for 24 hours, but there was ways that talks were repeated for various different time zones, or the same conversation happened, but it was just delivered by different people across the 24 hours. And I think that's actually a cool way of doing things. It does take a lot of work to be able to coordinate that sort of work, but I think if we can find different ways of doing things, I think it'll be easier.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to think of creative ways to connect the community. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions, please ask in the chat. Now is a good time. I'd like to thank Liz Stokes for introducing me to you. Do you want to talk a little bit just about, I actually don't know Liz very well, who Liz is and how you connected?
Liz is an extraordinaire and a person of amazingness. And Liz and I connected, it would have been, say, about 10 years ago. They gave a presentation at our conference about humanities research data, and I instantly wanted to get to know Liz because they had so many connections and a deep understanding of the importance of not just open source, but open access and open science and open data, and has this passion to be able to share knowledge with everyone. And that people like Liz are great people to know, and they introduced me to the data umbrella community, and hopefully I can introduce Liz to a number of other communities as well. But Liz is good people to have advocating for you. So yeah, thanks Liz for the connection. It's been awesome.
Well, thank you so much. And if there's anybody that I can introduce you to, for instance, I know Hugo over there, Hugo Bound Anderson, there's Jeremy Howard, there's I think Joel Nothman is a core contributor to Scikit-learn. I don't know what part of Australia he's in, but yeah. Let me know.
Will do. And please do, and for anyone, please do come to Australia, because I think The conferences are highly sought after. I don't know if anyone's been to any of the Linux Australia conferences, but it is such a comfortable place to be that you're amongst people that genuinely want to know what you've got to share. And even if you think that you don't have much to share, you definitely do. And the community is so welcoming and you feel just at home. It's not corporate in any way. The corporate sponsorship is purely to help fund the community. It's not to give us a sales pitch or anything like that. And I think lots of people. So John O'Bacon, for example, who's a community advocate, I think he's doing some consultancy work at the moment. He tries to come to any Linux Australia conference because it is just such a lovely atmosphere to be in. So I do welcome and hope that you all come and join one of our conferences soon.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And this will be posted on YouTube within 24 hours, and we'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thanks for joining me.